So I've been asked to give a lecture to all of you about something that interests me. This is an adapted presentation which me and Andre gave to the Philosophy Society last year, and it's essentially a bunch of different hypothetical situations / problems designed to get you thinking about what's the right thing to do. Obviously, I do philosophy as an A-level, so this may interest me more than some, but I don't really know what else to do it on. So the first problem is a very famous one, and it is called the train track problem. So imagine you're at the controls of a railway switch and there's an out of control trolley or carriage coming. The track branches into two. The track is on the course now, which has 5 people tied to it, or there's a track branching off with only 1 person tied to it. If you do nothing, the train will kill 5 people, but if you flip the switch, it will only kill 1. The dilemma in this situation is you may switch the control, but then you are actively taking part in and therefore responsible for that person's death. Whereas if you don't, you ultimately just stand by and let 5 people die when that wasn't the only option. Most people would instinctively switch the tracks to decrease the amount of harm done. But what puts people off is that you actively take part in the murder, when if you left the train on its course, it wouldn't really be your fault. But then you're still partially responsible for not helping at all, because you could decrease the amount of death done. It's a sticky situation that divides a lot of people. So I guess it's kind of what type of person you are, and that's how you'd figure it out, really. Then there's a bonus situation, which involves a fat man standing above a bridge with no second track. A man so large that if you were to push him onto the tracks, his body would prevent the trolley or carriage from smashing into the group of 5. So what do you do? Nothing, or push him onto the tracks? This one's a bit different because he was just an innocent bystander and you physically have to push him, which is obviously a bit scarier than having to pull a lever and switch the tracks. So this is just a different one to get you thinking as well. So the second problem is called the prisoner's dilemma, and let me set the scene. So a man and a woman have been arrested for robbing a bank and being in possession of firearms, and they're placed in separate isolation cells. Both care more about their personal freedom than what happens to their accomplice. Then a clever interrogator / prosecutor makes them both the following offer. You may choose to confess or stay silent. If you confess and your accomplice remains silent, then you will have all charges against you dropped, and using your testimony, your accomplice will do serious time. Likewise, if you stay silent and your accomplice talks, you do the time. He goes on to say, if you both confess, then you will both go to jail, but with early parole. And if you both remain silent, then because there's insufficient evidence, you would only go to jail based on firearm possession, which means that the problem in this dilemma is the confusion of whether or not to save yourself and have no jail time, which could backfire if your accomplice confesses too, or to stay silent with the worry that your accomplice confesses and goes free, or you both remain silent. If you actually work it out and you do the maths, the best outcome is for you both to stay silent and then get shorter jail times. But I guess you never know until you're in the moment. Then the third problem is called Theseus's ship, and it's quite a well-known problem in philosophy. So Theseus owned a ship, and the ship was entirely made of wood. Every time a piece of the ship needed replacing, it was replaced with a metal part. This went on for years until eventually it was made entirely of metal. So the question is it still the same ship? Some would say because the ship is completely different and none of the original parts are there, it isn't the same ship. But some would say the essence of the ship is always the same, and that's what makes it the same ship. It's like asking to point to a rugby team, for example, as team spirit. It isn't actually a thing, but it's an essence. What do you think? Do you think a non-physical thing can define an object, therefore making the ship the same ship? Okay, the fourth problem is called the concentration camp. You're an inmate in a concentration camp, and a sadistic guard is about to hang your son who tried to escape and wants you to pull the chair from underneath him so that he dies. He says that if you don't, he'll not only kill your son himself, but he'll kill 2 other innocent inmates as well. You don't have any doubt that he means what he says, so what should you do? Because obviously your connection to your son makes the action of pulling a chair out from under him and killing him unimaginably painful, but the thing you have to overcome is your emotional connection to your son to save people that haven't done anything wrong and are completely innocent. But in reality, your emotions probably would affect your judgment. But the moral thing would be to kill your son. Oh, that's a sad one. Problem 5 is a hard problem to get your head around, and in philosophy, it's called a logical paradox. There is no way it can make logical sense. So suppose someone tells you, I'm lying. If what they tell you is true, then they are lying, in which case their statement to you is false. On the other hand, if what they tell you is false, then they're not lying, in which case what they tell you is true. In short, the phrase I am lying is true. If it's true, then it's false, and if it's false, then it's true. The paradox arises for any sentences that says or implies that it in itself is false. These come up in philosophy and religious ideas and theories a lot when people try say things and they contradict themselves and they can never work, such as certain ethical approaches and how to do the right thing. Basically, there are certain things that we come across that we just cannot get our heads around. For example, the 2 pictures on the slide now. The penultimate problem is the question, would you rather save more people with a lower standard of life or save less people with a higher standard of life? For example, 10 billion people you choose to save with better lives, or 20 billion people with worse lives. Which would you pick? If you pick the 10 billion people because they have a better quality of life, think of all the lives that would have never happened, the families. But then if you choose to save 20 billion people with worse lives, it makes you question if you really did the right thing and if it's worth it. The 7th and final moral dilemma is called the emergency. So imagine that you're an emergency worker that's been called to the scene of an accident. When you see that it is your wife's car, you rush over to see that she is in the car with another man. She tells you that she has been having an affair with this person. Obviously upset, you take a minute to process. Then you realise that your partner is seriously hurt in this car crash and needs immediate attention. But there is a very high chance that they will still die. Then you see that her lover is bleeding heavily from the neck. You need to stop the flow of blood immediately. It will only take about 5 minutes to stop if you begin helping immediately, but it means that your partner will most certainly die. Do you help the person your partner is having an affair with, who will most likely to survive? Or let your emotions overcome you and help your wife, who has a much less likely chance of surviving? It's obviously a very difficult one because in that situation you wouldn't know what to do, but doctors they have to swear in when they become a doctor to this thing called the Hippocratic Oath, which is a promise to always do the right thing, always save the person with the most likely chance of surviving, basically. So if you're being a good doctor, then you would save the person your partner's having an affair with. But in reality, you probably would let your emotions get the better of you. So thank you for listening, and I hope I got you thinking. If you have any strong ideas about what you do in these situations, feel free to pop me an email.
Hello everyone, Mr. Woolner here. I'd just like to talk to you today about a book that I read recently, which I found really fascinating. It's called Exactly How Precision Engineers Created the Modern World. Now, I'm a religious studies teacher, not a design technology teacher nor a physicist. In fact, the last time I made anything in design technology was when I was in year 9 and I got a C. So I don't think I'm necessarily skilled in this, but that doesn't mean I can't find it interesting. And I found this book extraordinarily interesting, far more so than I would. I bought it on my Kindle because it was 99 pence, and I was delighted by what I'd read. So, it's by a gentleman called Simon Winchester. He is a journalist, he's an author. I suppose he's what we'd call a polymath, in that he is interested in and an expert in a very great number of fields. And it was inspired originally, his reason for writing it, because of his father. His father was an engineer, and his father brought home one day gauge blocks. Now, I didn't know what gauge blocks were, but he explained them very nicely, and I thought that a little YouTube video can explain it far better than I can. So as you can see here, the video is snappily titled Not Magnets. Now let's take a look at these blocks. There you are. So those are gauge blocks, and the old wooden chest that we just saw was exactly what was brought home by Simon Winchester's father, and who found it absolutely incredible that two blocks could be so finely produced that when you stuck them together, there was no gap, there was no air particles, there was nothing between them, and so pulling them apart became incredibly difficult. So another thing that I enjoyed about this book is that the chapters are arranged in order of tolerance, effectively. So it starts off with things which aren't particularly precise and goes to things which are incredibly precise. So it starts off with 0.1 inches of precision to that number, which I'm not going to begin to try to say in some sort of Illions term. And I'm not going to take you through the whole book. I'm simply going to talk to you about one or two of the chapters that I found particularly interesting. So starting at the beginning with 0.1 inches. And this is something called the Antikythera mechanism. It was carbon dated. It was found out to have been made around 200 BC, so 200 years before the birth of Christ, so 2,200 years and a bit before we are today. And it was found in 1900, so 120 years ago, by some Greek fishermen. They were diving for sponges. And this is the description they gave. A mess of more than 30 metallic and cleverly meshing gear wheels. One of these wheels has a diameter almost as wide as the object itself. Others were no wider than a centimetre. All has hand-cut triangular teeth. The tiniest wheels had as few as 15, and the enormous one had a then explicable 223. It looked as though all the wheels had been cut from a single plate of bronze. Now, they do say a picture paints 1,000 words, so that's what it looked like. Now, were I to have dug that up, I think, I don't know, Victorian steam train part, something like that. But in fact, it took until 2006, so 100 more years, until it was discovered that it was actually an analog computer that was made for determining the position of the moons, the planets, and the stars. And there's a much more common name for an analog computer for determining the position of the moons, the planets, and the stars. It's a clock. And it's a clock from 2,200 years ago. Now, it wasn't very accurate. That's why it's in the 0.1 inches chapter. And it's really, rather than a clock, purists amongst you will say, well, it's actually an astrolabe, which tells you about the position of the planets. But ultimately, it has to move at a precise mechanism in order to get it right. Now, the reason that it's a terrible astrolabe or clock is because, think about it, with the 0.1 inch, when we're measuring things, whether I was cutting, I don't know, bits of carrot for my supper, and I got them within 0.1 inch, I think, well, pretty accurate. However, over the billions of light years of distance between us and stars and galaxies and things like that, 1 inch, all of a sudden, of intolerance doesn't become this tiny fraction, but rather it becomes absolutely massive. So moving on to 0.00001 inches. And what I found especially fascinating about the book is that it wasn't so much the talk of precision engineering, but the things that it made me think about that I'd never thought about before. So here we are. Here's a smithy, a blacksmith's, and until the late 1700s, so we're 16 such and such, all metal objects, every single metal object was made individually by a blacksmith. Fine. Blacksmiths seem like good people. What's the problem with this? Well, the problem is the parts aren't interchangeable. And so for every metal object, if you wanted to fix it, you would have to go to a blacksmith and have your individual metal object fixed, or find have a new part made for you. So let's say whenever a part, for example, a gun. I mean, we're in the late 1700s, so the era of imperialism and conquest. Part of a gun, for example, a replacement would have to be found that matched that specific item. Here's a little diagram that shows all the different things going on in a flintlock musket. So we've got the hammer, we've got a jaw screw, the jaws, flint, the frizzen, the pan, and the frizzen spring. Now, if you're on the battlefield and your gun jammed in some kind of way, then you don't have in your pouch little ones like this to sort it out. You don't even have standardized screws to take away this screw that you can see directly below the jaws and the flint. You would have to go to a blacksmith who would then measure and beat into shape a piece of metal that fit yours, and he'd do it by trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. These days we can't imagine that. Imagine if, I was thinking about staples, so imagine if you had to make individual staples to go in your stapler every single time. It's just ludicrous. But this was the world in which people lived. So no one ever thought to produce interchangeable parts until a Frenchman, as you can see from his name, Honoré Blanc, did this in 1795. And they had to be incredibly accurate, to within a 0.00001 inches of tolerance. Imagine a world without interchangeable parts today. Imagine, I don't know, any DIY you were doing at home and you had to get new parts made. You couldn't just go to Screwfix and get a load of equal parts in order to replace it. If your car broke down and there was something wrong with the fan, you couldn't just go and buy another replacement fan for your Ford Focus, or, I mean, you're independently educated, so let's say Maserati. You instead would have to go to a blacksmith who would make one and tinker with it until it fit. It's just ludicrous. And yet this was the world in which we live. So now we're getting to huge tolerances, and here was a chapter on the Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engine. Now, I didn't know that I knew what this was until he said that it was the engine in the A380 Super Jumbos, the double-decker airplane, the largest passenger plane in the world. And there's a nice little demonstration of how a jet engine works for you. Air flows through it. It only has effectively one moving part, that turbine moving in the center there, and some of the air is moved in. It is heated with fuel and pushed out, and because the air, once it is heated, is pushed out with greater power than the air flowing around it, it moves the plane forwards. As it says there, jet engines work by condensing air, heating it, and pushing it out again. And it takes what is apparently about the volume of air contained in a squash court and pushes it out, condenses it into what would fit in a suitcase. So it does a good job of condensing. Now here's the science bit. The blades in a jet engine spin at 1,000 revolutions per minute, Mr. North there. And the gas flowing over them, you can see in the central section with the nice red arrows, is 1,600 degrees C, which is very hot indeed. The problem is, the metal these blades are made out of, the melting point is lower. And so, by rights, the process of a jet engine working should melt the engine into a solid lump. And then, of course, it's not going to take off. Well, it would drop out of the sky if it did manage to take off. So what's going on here? Well, the way that this was dealt with was the clever chaps at Rolls-Royce came up with a way of recirculating the air to cool the blades down themselves. So these blades that you can see at the very front of the cone, see there's a pointy sort of triangle bit where the air first goes in. When we look at them, and you can see three here zoomed in, they have thousands, not exaggerating, literally thousands of tiny holes machined into them. And so the air, as you can see with the third diagram, the air flows into the blade. So these blades, which are really, they're quite wafer thin. They're not big, but certainly thinner than your arm. Have got these tiny, tiny holes manufactured through them, and in so doing, it sucks air in, and then whilst they're spinning round, air is pushed out over them, and it's called an air cushion. And it's only 1 millimeter thick, but because that precision engineering takes place, those milling of those tiny, tiny holes to create those channels, so it's not a solid object, rather it's got channels in it, that allows the outside of the blade to be 650 degrees, which therefore doesn't melt at the 1455 that I quoted earlier. And what's even more fascinating is, rather than like the blacksmith melting a load of metal and pouring it into some mold and then hammering it out, it's just too delicate for that. It can't be done that way. And so this is where we see the limits of what human precision can be. And this precision now instead is the precision of computers. And so in order to do this, they're actually grown. I'm not quite sure how, as I say, I'm no scientist, but they are grown from a single crystal, which then as it goes, blossoms into this metal, which fills in the mold, because it can't have any defects in it. If it does have any defects, well, here's our friend at YouTube. Needless to say, this is not what one wants when the stewardess has just passed out the complimentary peanuts. Finally, that's a big number. And this number we find in what is called the ASML machine. It's a machine that would fit in your living room. It's not huge, and it costs $100 million. And there are a lot of them in the Netherlands. That's actually where they're made. These things make microchips. Now, in the 1950s, a gentleman called Moore came up with a law that computing power would double every year. So a computer from last year will be half as powerful as one this year, and next year's will be twice as powerful as that. And it was in some ways a self-fulfilling prophecy, because once that law had been established, scientists have been racing to keep up with that law, because they don't want it to go for them to hit a low bar. They don't want it to be seen that they haven't fulfilled what they're supposed to do. And so it's carried on. It was actually adjusted to doubling every 2 years, but nonetheless still impressive. And it's transistors which make the world go round. There are that many of them. I believe that's 15 quintillion transistors in the world. They're in your mobile phone, they're in the laptop into which I'm speaking right now, your television, your car. They make microchips go round. And it's not the chips themselves. The chips are made of many, many, many of these transistors, and ultimately a transistor just turns on and off. That's why we talk about binary computers, on-off states, and thus they allow a flow of electric either through them or not through them. Electricity, sorry. That looks like a big number. It's in fact more than all the leaves on all the trees on the planet. And man has made those. So, I mean, I'm sitting in my garden to record this. You might be able to hear the birdsong. I can see countless leaves. I wouldn't want to spend my life trying to count them. Just simply sitting in my garden. Imagine all the leaves on all the trees on the planet. And we, mankind, in the time that we've been building computer chips, let's say 60 years, have made more transistors than there are leaves on all the trees on the planet. It's just insane. How are they made? In Winchester's words, he talks about slivers of glass. So they are 1,000th of a size, times rather, the size of human hair. And those are rubbed down so they are thinner in order to create these transistors. In fact, they're so small that there's a processor made by Intel. I used to remember all computers having Intel Pentium. Indeed, my laptop says it right on the keyboard. Processor this Skylake one that they've made are smaller than the wavelength of light that the human eye can perceive. They are literally invisible, not just microscopic, not just so tiny. They are so small that the light bouncing off them, the wavelength of it is smaller than our eye can even make out. It is impossible to see them. And that big old machine there makes them. It's mind-boggling. But in order to do that, it has to work to a precision of that fraction of an inch, something that no human could do. It blew my mind when he told me about it. And that's what I'm talking about. Each of those little, not just the chip, and not just the little gold flecks that are sort of a irregular rectangle rather, but in fact on each of those little flecks are thousands of transistors. That's what we're talking about. So we start off with the anti-Kythera mechanism. We move through to interchangeable parts, the way a jet engine works, to that which has allowed me to produce this presentation for you today. And they're all down to precision engineering. Now, 2,000 years ago, that was the best someone could do. But in human history, to have come from, really, there's only 10,000 years of recorded history, to have come all the way from, at the start of that, using stone tools, breaking bits of flint into axes so that we could scratch away at wood and chop things in half and kill animals, make spears. And then in 10,000 years of history, to go from there to that microchip, to flight, to space flight, to going to other planets in 10,000 years, whereas the preceding amount of history, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. It's astonishing what we've accomplished. And so I hope that this inspires you in a way that it inspired me. I hope that those of you who are interested in STEM keep going, because you're the ones that will help me continue to make presentations like this and read it on my Kindle. And I hope that those of you who thought, I'm really more of a philosopher, historian, English lit kind of guy or gal, you can pause and think, well, this is really quite interesting. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi everyone, this is Mr. Ramsay here. I'm filming this Scholars Talk for you using Screencastify, which is a bit unusual, but I hope it works out okay. I'll try to keep under 10 minutes. If you have any questions and answers, please just message me afterwards and we can engage in a chat then. Now, my talk is all to do with visual arts and music. It's to do with identity and authorship and copyright and all of those kind of issues, and how in music and in the visual arts there can actually be comparisons. Now, I started this off when I was listening to an artist called MF Doom, who is a current rapper. He's kind of British American. He's not super well known, but he's quite well respected. He's got a very kind of poetic, subversive style to his music and to his rapping. And he wears this mask. So that's kind of one of his, his things. He wears this kind of metal mask, so no one really knows his identity. Now, that in itself is a little bit like other artists, who've done the same thing in the past, like bands like Slipknot, for example. And so far, he's been pretty good at kind of hiding his real identity as a performer. And he has this as part of his kind of character. It's part of his kind of onstage persona. He likes to be seen as like an anti-hero, like a villain. And that mirrors his musical style and what he actually raps about. But one thing that he did a while ago got him in a lot of trouble. He basically started to irritate people and annoy his fans by booking gigs and presenting gigs and kind of coming up with shows, and then he just wouldn't turn up. So he'd get someone else, just some random person, put them in his metal mask, and they'd go out and they'd start lip syncing and doing a really bad job of it. And then they'd get booed off stage and everyone would get really, really frustrated and there'd be a lot of anger. Now, for him, that was not like I mean, partly it was a gimmick. It wasn't like a kind of deliberate ploy to kind of irritate people. It was to do with and wind people up. It was to do with his ideas and his notions about identity and expectation and being in control of what you do as an artist, and how you present yourself as an artist. And of course, as you can see from this quote, it actually raised his profile, because whilst it seemed like a negative thing to do, there's that old adage, there's no press like bad press. It doesn't really matter. There's other artists who've done similar things, though. And one who, was in the news recently, sadly because he passed away, was David Bowie. David Bowie famously had a really long career. And throughout that career, he kept on reinventing himself. And he kept on having these onstage personas, different personas. So David Bowie wasn't even his real name anyway, but he was also known for a while as Ziggy Stardust. And then famously, in kind of a self-referential moment, he kills off that character in one of his songs, in one of his albums, and then he reinvents himself again, a different time as a character called the Thin White Duke. And he kept on doing this up to the point when he passed away, because he had such a long career and he had such different musical genres throughout his profession. Other artists do the same. Madonna's a good example. Madonna as well, been around since the mid-80s. And so to keep interest and to kind of keep, curiosity in what she does, continually reinvents herself and manages to stay relevant and stay kind of relatively fresh and keep changing her musical style as she goes with her visual image too. Prince is another one. Prince famously fell out with his record label. And so he changed his name from Prince to an unpronounceable symbol, which is that one in the top right. You couldn't even say it. And so people had to go around calling him the symbol formerly known as Prince. And that was to do with copyright. That was to do with an issue of who owns his music. Is it the record label or is it him as the artist? All very curious stuff. But where kind of I can find an interesting link is to something I'm more familiar with, and that is to the visual arts, where these issues of identity and authorship are still there, but they're just slightly different. On the left-hand side, you have an artist called Velázquez. Velázquez is a Spanish artist, and he's round in the 1600s. So we're talking a massive time shift, really, really early compared to the music we were just on about a second ago. And Velázquez is, he's painting in an era before photography and mass communication. So things are very, very different. He's born into a noble family, a reasonably noble family, but through his ability and his natural aptitude for painting, he works really hard, and eventually he gets elevated to the status of court painter. Now, that basically means you've made it, because it means that you're attached to the king and the queen and the royal family, who control the country in the Spanish Empire. And the king, Philip IV, is on the right-hand side, who Velázquez gets on very well with. Now, Velázquez paints lots of different styles of paintings through his career, and he changes as well. And he has also a very long and kind of notorious, famous status in that time in Spain and in Europe. And the Spanish Empire, if you're going to be attached to any court in the 1600s, it's probably best to be part of the Spanish Empire court. And the reason for that is that the Spanish Empire is, at that time, the kind of global superpower. It's the global superpower in terms of economics, military strength, political influence. And you can see that at the time, this is a map of the Spanish Empire at the time, it's huge. And it gets enormous amounts of wealth from South America and the Americas, which gets back to Spain all the time. Velázquez is also a bit of a diplomat. So he's an artist, but he's also very cunning. He's very clever. He's well liked. He's well spoken. He's fluent in a few different languages. And so he gets sent around a bit like a emissary and a bit like a diplomat would these days. He goes around meeting people, representing the will of Spain, and also painting people and passing political messages and creating trade deals at the same time. So he's a very handy person to have as part of your court. One of his masterpieces is a painting called Las Meninas, and it's a painting of the Spanish princess. But it's also a painting of Velázquez painting. and you looking at the painting and looking at the scene whilst he's creating it. It's a really complex painting, but when you look at it visually, the style is relatively dated, and we don't find the style of the painting necessarily interesting to ourselves now, because it's not bright, it's not kind of superbly rendered. It's quite old. It looks old, and so it can switch off quite a few casual observers these days. But that's a shame, because he's so intelligent with what he does. And this painting on its own, I could talk to you about it for hours. I'm going to skip over. I'm going to talk instead about this painting on the left, which is a painting of a man called Juan de Pareja. And it's produced in 1650 when Velázquez is sent on one of his diplomatic missions. So Velázquez is sent on a diplomatic mission to Rome. Now, at the time, Rome is also extremely influential because it's where the Pope has his base of power. And the Pope controls the Catholic world. So whilst the papal states aren't particularly big in terms of territory, they exert a lot of influence over the different nation states at the time. So the Pope, with the Spanish Empire and the Spanish kings, is probably a global superpower, it's fair to say. Now, Velázquez goes to Rome, and he's told to go to Rome to talk about different issues between Spain and the Catholic world. But also he's charged with the task of painting the Pope at the time, who was a man called Innocent X, who was on the right-hand side, who he does eventually meet and he does eventually paint. But before he gets there, the cardinals, who are the group of people who control everything beneath the Pope, basically say to him, no, you're not allowed to paint the Pope. Why are you allowed to paint the Pope? We don't know who you are. We don't know if you're any good. And Velázquez gets a little bit miffed about this, because he's in his 50s now. He's got an incredibly good international reputation as a painter, and he can't really be dealing with this. So the cardinals say, okay, look, paint something. Paint a self-portrait. Go on, paint a self-portrait. If it's really good, we'll let you paint the Pope. And Velázquez goes away, and he's a bit annoyed. And he wants to do something different and a little bit daring. So he gets this guy called Juan. Now, Juan is part of his retinue, and he asks Juan de Pareja, which is his name, to sit for this portrait, and he paints it, and that's the one on the left. Now, it's not like an extraordinary painting, and it's not him at his most virtuoso, but it's good. And he takes it back to the cardinals, and he unveils it, and the cardinals say, oh, this is a brilliant portrait, but it's of that bloke over there. This doesn't make any sense. And Velázquez argues something that's quite persuasive, and this is where you get this link over to the music and the musicians who I was talking about earlier. He basically says, look, anything that I paint, anything that I choose to paint, whether it's a landscape, whether it's a religious scene, whether it's a portrait, whether it's a self-portrait, anything that I paint is a reflection of me. It is a self-portrait, because I'm the one who picks up the brush, I'm the one who makes the choices, I'm the one who determines where to put the kind of brush strokes. I'm the one who actually makes it. So anything that I do is actually a self-portrait. And the cardinals find that relatively persuasive. They find that relatively interesting. And it does have that overlap with the musicians we were discussing earlier. However, what he's also doing is he's doing one thing even further. And this is where you get this interesting crossover with MF Doom. It's almost like a protest piece, because what he's done is he's painted someone who is deliberately antagonistic to the Catholic Church. So it's not just to do with the fact that it's not a self-portrait, it's also who this is a painting of. Now, Juan de Pareja comes from a mixed heritage background, and he's actually a slave. He's a slave to Velázquez's workshop and retinue, and eventually Velázquez frees him. But he is still nevertheless a slave, and he comes from mixed heritage background. And now that wouldn't be an issue. But in the 1650s, it's a massive issue, because Juan is half Spanish and he's half Moorish. And Moorish is kind of a dated way of describing the Ottoman and Muslim empires of North Africa at the time. Now, this becomes controversial because of two reasons. The first is that it's only been a couple of hundred years since the Catholic Church was waging a religious war in the Middle East around Jerusalem with the empires of Islam. Bloody warfare, really, really terrible stuff, very kind of divisive. And that's only kind of recently ceased. The other reason this is very controversial is because, again, a couple of hundred years before, Spain is actually controlled, partially and fully controlled at one point, by the North African empires of Islam. And so the Spanish themselves are actually quite nervous about people of mixed heritage in their country. And at the point when they reconquest their country, they make the decision to either kill people of mixed or Muslim heritage, force them out of the country, or forcibly make them renounce Islam and become Christian. So Juan, all of a sudden, is elevated to a point of comparison between himself and the Pope. This is really daring and could ultimately lead in Velázquez getting in a lot of trouble. But because he does it subtly and because he does it eruditely, and because Juan is actually a convert rather than fully Muslim, he just about manages to get away with it. But it does have that kind of air of defiance, and it does have that air of subversity that art and music can bring, and can make you question really deeply issues of identity and issues even of democracy of kind of faith, of race, of religion. It's really deep stuff. Now, it's not really like an answer or conclusion to this talk. It's just to make you think about kind of identity in different spheres. And there's loads of examples you can use. It's not like these are the only examples you can use. There are hundreds of examples you can use. And I'm sure you could come up with some yourselves. Anyway, I hope that's been of interest. I'm going to clock out now. And as I said, if you have any questions or issues, just email them directly and we can engage in a chat. Thanks for listening.
Здравейте, аз съм Рада и днес ще ви разкажа за кирилицата и за българският език. Or in other words, hi everybody, I'm Rada and today I'm going to tell you about the Cyrillic alphabet and the Bulgarian language. In 886 AD, the Bulgarian Empire introduced the Glagolitic alphabet, also known as Glagolica in Bulgarian. It was devised by the saints Constantine Kirill-Filosof and Methodi in the 850s. This is the first Slavonic language with its own alphabet. In fact, the Bulgarian word for alphabet, azbuka, originates from the first two letters of the Glagolitic alphabet, as in buki. The name for Glagolica comes from the Slavonic verb glagolati, to speak. It is a completely original graphic system in which every letter stands for a single sound, and the letters for sounds with similar characteristics have similar graphic designs. In those medieval times, religious dogma stipulated that the holy texts can only exist in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew because their alphabets were created by God. To make the first Slavonic alphabet just as divine, Cyril, or Kirill, created the new letters using the three elements that were holy for Christianity: the cross, the triangle, and the circle. However, the Cyrillic, as we know it today, was devised by a disciple of Saint Cyril and Methodius, named Saint Clement of Ohrid, or Clement Ohridsky, who popularized both alphabets among the Christianized Slavs. In 1980, Pope John Paul II declared Saint Cyril and Methodius co-patron saints of Europe. From January 1st, 2007, when Bulgaria entered the European Union, the Cyrillic alphabet became the third official alphabet in the EU after the Latin and the Greek alphabets. On May 24, Bulgaria celebrates the Day of Bulgarian Education and Culture in the Slavonic alphabet. In the first picture, you can see Saint Cyril and Methodius. Cyril is the one to the right and Methodius is the one to the left. And then the second picture shows the Glagolitic alphabet, or Glagolica, as we say in Bulgarian. And it's important to know that we don't use any more Glagolica. It is just the predecessor of Kirilica, which is our current alphabet. Българската азбука, or the Bulgarian alphabet. Cyrillic consisted of 24 letters based on Greek signs and 12 letters similar to the Glagolitic script, which correspond to the specific sounds in Bulgarian such as b, j, z, sh, st, ch, ц, etc. As a result of the development of the Bulgarian language and after the introduction of several reforms, implemented by laws in the 20th century, the modern Bulgarian alphabet has 30 letters. In the picture you can see the printed version of the letters and the written version of the letters, which is how we learn to write when we start school. And you can also see the transliteration in terms of English, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. Българският език, the Bulgarian language. Bulgarian has more than 200,000 words, and their different forms are 10 times more than that. There are also more than 40 different tenses across Bulgarian's 2 aspects in 5 minutes. For example, the verb read, chita, itself has 52 different forms. Some of them are чита, четеш, четяхте, четяха, щяха да четат, щях да съм чела, щях да съм чел, бях чела, бях чел, щяхме да четем, щяхте да четете, четяхме, ще четат, бяха чели, and so on. Believe me, even I couldn't think of all 52 forms. So now I'm going to talk about grammatica, which translates to grammar. So Bulgarian has 3 different grammatical genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. For example, in masculine, words such as grad, which means city, sin, which means son, mosh, which means man, and then in feminine we have žena, which means woman, dăștărea, daughter, ulița, street. And then in neutral we have dete, which means child, and ezero, which means lake. Another interesting aspect of Bulgarian is the word order. Although Bulgarian has almost no noun cases, its word order is rather free. It is even freer than the word order of some languages that have cases, for example German. This is due to the agreement between the subject and the verb of a sentence. Moving on to verbs, or glagoli, which are the most complicated part of Bulgarian grammar. They are divided into 3 conjugations and can take up to 3,000 distinct forms, as they also have lexical aspect, voice, 9 tenses, 5 moods, and 6 non-finite verbal forms. Another interesting part are the adjectives, or прилагателни. So the Bulgarian adjective agrees in gender, number, and definiteness with the noun, and is usually placed before it. The comparative and the superlative form are formed analytically. For example, красив, по-красив, най-красив, which translates to beautiful, more beautiful, and the most beautiful. And finishing off with pronouns, which translates to местоимение. The Bulgarian pronouns vary in gender, number, definiteness, and case. And here you can see a few of the most distinguishable types of Bulgarian pronouns. Знаете ли, че? Or in other words, did you know that? As I said, I'm going to talk more about transliteration, which, if you didn't know, is the process of transferring a word from the alphabet of one language to that of another. In 2009, Bulgaria passed the law of transliteration, which makes it possible for Bulgarian geographical names, names of historical figures, etc., to be transmitted from the Cyrillic alphabet into the Latin. For example, Balkan, Rodopi, Rila. In addition to the official transliteration systems, there are many so-called unusual methods that bear the common name Shlokovica. Its name comes from a Bulgarian alcohol, which is usually a fake one. Shlokovica includes writing in Bulgarian with the Latin alphabet, and this has been widely criticized for its effect on spelling and grammar, and since 2006, most Bulgarian language forms introduce rules against its use. In relation to this, and as a way of mocking the Shlokovica, an emblematic Bulgarian novel called Under the Yoke, or Podigoto, by one of Bulgaria's most prominent authors, Ivan Vazov, was published again, this time using Shlokovica, to shine a light on the real threat this transliteration is posing on Bulgarian literacy, language, culture, and identity. So in the first picture you can see the actual Bulgarian book with the Bulgarian alphabet, which says Ivan Vazov Podigoto. In the picture to the right, you can see the transliterated version, which is with the Latin alphabet. And on this slide, you can see pictures from the English translation of the novel. And another interesting fact is from the Beatles song Yellow Submarine, where at exactly 1 minute and 35 seconds you can hear Bulgarian speech, in particular Pusni mi verigata, which can literally be translated to drop the chain. And before I go, guys, I have a little challenge for you. So if you go to the third slide, you can find the Bulgarian alphabet and how you can transliterate each letter into the Latin alphabet. So my challenge for you guys is to try and write your names in Bulgarian. And lastly, I think it's really important to mention after all this information that you actually pronounce my name Rada Pandeva, not Rada Pandeva. But I know it's hard, but I just wanted to let you know, guys, just this little fact. So thank you very much for your attention. Благодаря за вниманието. And hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye.